Chapter 6. Shasta Among the Tombs. Shasta ran lightly along the roof on tiptoes. It felt hot to his bare feet. He was only a few seconds scrambling up the wall at the far end, and when he got to the corner he found himself looking down into a narrow, smelly street, and there was a rubbish heap against the outside of the wall, just as Corin had told him. Before jumping down he took a rapid glance round to get his bearings. Apparently he'd now come over the crown of the island hill on which Tashbaan is built. Everything sloped away before him. Flat roofs below, flat roofs, down to the towers and battlements of the city's northern wall. And beyond that was the river, and beyond the river a short slope covered with gardens. But beyond that again there was something he'd never seen the like of. A great yellowish grey thing, flat as a calm sea and stretching for miles. On the far side of it were huge bluey things, lumpy but with jagged edges, and some of them with white tops. The desert, the mountains, thought Shasta. He jumped down onto the rubbish and began trotting along downhill as fast as he could in the narrow lane, which soon brought him into a wider street where there were more people. No one bothered to look at a little ragged boy running along on bare feet. Still he was anxious and uneasy till he turned a corner, and there he saw the city gate in front of him. Here he was pressed and jostled a bit, for a good many other people were also going out. And on the bridge beyond the gate the crowd became quite a slow procession, more like a queue than a crowd. Out there, with the clear running water on each side, it was deliciously fresh after the smell and heat and noise of Tashbaan. When once Shasta had reached the far end of the bridge, he found the crowd melting away. Everyone seemed to be going either to the left or to the right along the riverbank. He went straight ahead, up a road that didn't appear to be much used between gardens. In a few paces he was alone, and a few more brought him to the top of the slope. There he stood and stared. It was like coming to the end of the world, for all the grass stopped quite suddenly a few feet before him, and the sand began. Endless level sand, like on a seashore, but a bit rougher because it was never wet. The mountains, which now looked further off than before, loomed ahead. Greatly to his relief, he saw, about 5 minutes' walk away on his left, what must certainly be the tombs, just as Bree had described them. Great masses of mouldering stone, shaped like gigantic beehives, but a little narrower. They looked very black and grim, for the sun was now setting behind them. He turned his face west and trotted towards the tombs. He could not help looking out very hard for any sign of his friends, though the setting sun shone in his face so that he could hardly see anything. And anyway, he thought, of course they'll be round on the far side of the furthest tomb, not this side where anyone might see them from the city. There were about 12 tombs, each with a low arched doorway that opened into absolute blackness. They were dotted about in no kind of order, so that it took a long time going round this one and going round that one before you could be sure that you'd looked round every side of every tomb, and this is what Shasta had to do. There was nobody there. It was very quiet here out on the edge of the desert, and now the sun had really set. Suddenly, from somewhere behind him, there came a terrible sound. Shasta's heart gave a great jump, and he had to bite his tongue to keep himself from screaming. Next moment he realised what it was. The horns of Tashbaan blowing for the closing of the gates. "Don't be a silly little coward," he said to himself. "Why, it's only the same noise you heard this morning." But there's a great difference between a noise heard letting you in with your friends in the morning and a noise heard alone at nightfall, shutting you out. And now that the gates were shut, he knew there was no chance of the others joining him that evening. They're either shut up for Tashbaan, for the night, thought Shasta, or else they've gone on without me. It's just the sort of thing that Aravis would do, but Bree wouldn't. Oh, he wouldn't now, would he? In this idea about Aravis, Shasta was once more quite wrong. She was proud and could be hard enough, but she was as true as steel and would never have deserted a companion, whether she liked him or not. Now that Shasta knew he would have to spend the night alone, it was getting darker every minute, he began to like the look of the place less and less. There was something very uncomfortable about those great shapes of silent stone. He'd been trying his hardest for a long time not to think about ghouls, but he couldn't keep it up any longer. "Ow! Ow! Help!" he shouted suddenly, for at that very moment he felt something touch his leg. I don't think anyone can be blamed for shouting if something comes up from behind and touches him, not in a place and at such a time and when they're frightened already. Shasta, at any rate, was too frightened to run. Anything would be better than being chased round and round the burial places of the ancient kings, with something he dared not look at behind him. Instead, he did what was really the most sensible thing he could do. He looked round, and his heart almost burst with relief. What had touched him was only a cat. The light was too bad now for Shasta to see much of the cat, except that it was very big and solemn. It looked as if it might have lived a long time among the tombs, alone. Its eyes made you think it knew secrets it would not tell. "Puss, puss," said Shasta. "I suppose you're not a talking cat." The cat stared at him even harder. Then it started walking away, and of course Shasta followed it. It led him right through the tombs and out on the desert side of them. And there it sat down, bolt upright, with its tail curled round its feet and its face set towards the desert and towards Narnia and the north, as still as if it were watching for some enemy. Shasta lay down beside it with its back against the cat's and its face towards the tomb. Because if anyone's ever nervous, there's nothing like having your face towards the danger and having something warm and solid at your back. The sound wouldn't have seemed very comfortable to you, but Shasta had been sleeping on the ground for weeks and hardly noticed it. Very soon he was asleep, and even though in his dreams he went on wondering what had happened to Bree and Aravis and Hwin. He was wakened suddenly by a noise he had never heard before. Perhaps it was only a nightmare, said Shasta to himself. At the same moment he noticed the cat had gone from his back and he wished it hadn't. But he lay quite still without even opening his eyes, because he felt sure he would be more frightened if he sat up and looked around at the tombs and the loneliness, just as you or I might lie still with the clothes over our heads. But then the noise came again, a harsh, piercing cry from behind him out of the desert, and then of course he had to open his eyes and sit up. The moon was shining brightly. The tombs, far bigger and nearer than he thought they would be, looked grey in the moonlight. In fact, they looked horribly like huge people draped in grey robes that covered their heads and faces. They were not at all nice things to have near you when spending a night alone in a strange place. But the noise had come from the opposite side, from the desert. Shasta had to turn his back on the tombs, he didn't like that much, and stared out across the level sand, and the wild cry rang out again. "Oh, I hope it's not more lions," thought Shasta. It was in fact not very like a lion's roar that he'd heard on the night when they'd met Hwin and Aravis, and was really the cry of a jackal. But of course Shasta didn't know this. Even if he had known, he wouldn't have much wanted to meet a jackal either. The cries rang out again and again. "There's more than one of them, whatever they are," thought Shasta, "and they're coming nearer." I suppose that if he'd been an entirely sensible boy, he would have gone back through the tombs nearer to the river, where there were houses and the wild beasts would be less likely to come. But then there were, or at least he thought there were, the ghosts. To go back through the tombs would mean going past those dark openings of the tombs and what might come out of them. It may have been silly, but Shasta felt he would rather risk the wild beasts. Then, as the cries came nearer and nearer, he began to change his mind. He was just going to run for it when suddenly, between him and the desert, a huge animal bounded into view. As the moon was behind it, it looked quite black, and Shasta didn't know what it was, except that it had a very big, shaggy head and went on 4 legs. It didn't seem to have noticed Shasta, for it suddenly stopped and turned its head towards the desert and let out a roar that re-echoed through the tombs and seemed to shake the sand under Shasta's feet. The cries of the other creatures suddenly stopped, and he thought he could hear the feet scampering away. The great beast turned to examine Shasta. It's a lion. I know it's a lion, thought Shasta. I'm done. I wonder, will it hurt much? I wish it was over. I wonder, does anything happen to people when they're dead? Oh, here it comes. And he shut his eyes and his teeth shut. But instead of teeth and claws, he only felt something warm lying down at his feet. And when he opened his eyes, he said, "Why, it's not nearly as big as I thought. It's only half the size. No, it's not even quarter of the size. Oh, I do declare, it's only the cat. I must have dreamed all that about it being as big as a horse." And whether he really had been dreaming or not, what was now lying at his feet and staring at him out of his countenance with green, big, unwinking eyes was the cat, though certainly one of the largest cats he'd ever seen. "Oh, Puss," gasped Shasta, "I am glad to see you again. I've been having such horrible dreams." And he once lay down again, back to back with the cat, as they had been at the beginning of the night. The warmth from it spread all over him. "I'll never do anything nasty to a cat as long as I live," said Shasta, half to the cat and half to himself. "I did once, you know. I threw stones at a half-starved, mangy old stray." "Oh, hey, stop that!" For the cat had turned round and given him a scratch. "None of that," said Shasta. "It isn't as if you could understand what I'm saying." Then he dozed off. Next morning, when he woke, the cat was gone. The sun was already up and the sand hot. Shasta, very thirsty, sat up and rubbed his eyes. The desert was blindingly white, and although there was the murmur of noises from the city behind him where he sat, everything was perfectly still. When he looked a little to the left and west, so that the sun was not in his eyes, he could see the mountains and the far side of the desert, so sharp and clear that they looked only a stone's throw away. He particularly noticed one blue height that divided into 2 peaks at the top, and decided that it must be Mount Pyre. "That's our direction, judging by what the raven said," he thought, "so I'll just make sure of it so as not to waste any time when the others turn up." So he made a good, deep, straight furrow with his foot, pointing exactly to Mount Pyre. His next job, clearly, was to get something to eat and drink. Shasta trotted back through the tombs. They looked quite ordinary now, and he wondered how he could ever have been afraid of them, and down into the cultivated land by the river's side. There were a few people about, but not very many, for the city gates had been open several hours, and the early morning crowds had already gone. So he had no difficulty in doing a little raiding, as Bree called it. It involved climb over a garden wall, and the results were 3 oranges, a melon, a fig or 2, and a pomegranate. After that he went down to the river bank, but not too near the bridge, and had a drink. The water was so nice that he took off his hot and dirty clothes and had a dip. For of course Shasta, having lived all on the shore all his life, had learnt to swim almost as soon as he'd learnt to walk. When he came out, he lay on the grass looking across the water at Tashbaan, all the splendour and strength and glory of it. But that made him realise the dangers of it too. He suddenly realised that the others might have reached the tombs while he was bathing and gone on without me as likely as not. So he He dressed in a fright and tore back at such a speed that he was all hot and thirsty when he arrived, and so the good of his bathe was gone. Like most days when you're sat alone and waiting for something, this day seemed about 100 hours long. He'd plenty to think of course, but sitting alone just thinking is pretty slow. He thought a good deal about the Narnians and especially about Corin. He wondered what had happened when they discovered that the boy who'd been lying on the sofa and hearing all their secret plans wasn't really Corin after all. It was unpleasant to think of all those nice people imagining him as a traitor. But as the sun slowly climbed up to the top of the sky and then slowly began going down to the west, and no one came and nothing at all happened, he began to get more and more anxious. And of course, he now realised that they'd arranged to wait for one another at the tombs, but no one had said anything about how long. He couldn't wait there for the rest of his life, and soon it would be dark again, and he would have another night just like last night. A dozen different plans went through his head, all wretched ones, and at last he fixed on the worst plan of all. He decided to wait till it was dark, and then go back to the river and steal as many melons as he could carry, and set out for Mount Pyre alone, trusting for his direction to the line he'd drawn that morning in the sand. It was a crazy idea, and if he'd read as many books as you have about journeys over deserts, he would never have dreamed of it. But Shasta had read no books at all. Before the sun set, something did happen. Shasta was sitting in the shadow of one of the tombs when he looked up and saw two horses coming towards him. Then his heart gave a great leap, for he recognised them as Bree and Hwin. But the next moment his heart went down into his toes again. There was no sign of Aravis. The horses were being led by a strange man, an armed man pretty handsomely dressed like an upper slave in a great family. Bree and Hwin were no longer got up like pack horses, but saddled and bridled. And what could it all mean? It's a trap, thought Shasta. Someone's caught Aravis, and perhaps they've tortured her and she's given the whole thing away. And they want me to jump out and run and speak to Bree, and then I'll be caught too. And yet if I don't, I may be losing my only chance to meet the others. Oh, I do wish I knew what had happened. And he skulked behind the tombs, looking out every few minutes and wondering what was the least dangerous thing to do.